Hey, Greg. Thanks for joining me today on the System2 podcast. To give everyone a quick bio on Greg, he has a business called Punks and Pinstripes. He empowers rebels in business to find their tribe, change the world, and make money in that order. He wrote the international bestseller, This Might Get You Fired, which I can't wait to hear more about, which chronicled his journey into corporate executive leadership after his startup got acquired. He was a decent investor on Wall Street who got lucky and predicted the 2008 financial crisis before anyone else. And above all, he's a dad, brother, husband, and a product of Brooklyn. Greg, it's really nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start off by learning more about you? What's your story? Who's Greg?
I grew up in Rockaway, Queens. Rockaway, when I was growing up there, was called the Irish Riviera. So I grew up in kind of New York City in the 80s and 90s when it could have gone either way. You know, it was not gentrified. It was pretty tough. It's one of the few times in New York history where the population of the city was declining. And I loved it. I loved it was feral. And as a result of being feral, it was affordable and it had this like creative chaos that being a little bit nasty and unstable sort of fed. And a lot of that is gone now. And I lived through it sort of disappearing.
What do you remember from the 80s and 90s in New York City? What are some stories that stick out to you that exemplify how feral and raw and nice it was?
Well, so like by the time my friends and I were 16 years old, there used to be this bar on First Avenue and 5th Street, I'm going to say, 3rd Street. It was called the Three of Cups Lounge. And we were regulars there at the age of 16 to the point where the bartender knew our names and would come in and the first round was on the house. We were 16 years old because that neighborhood, the East Village, was so like broke and full of heroin and drugs. And we were just a bunch of like sweet kids that just wanted to have a beer, and listen to some punk music. And that was really like, we didn't think twice about it. It wasn't even where I grew up in Rockaway. It was, 2 neighborhoods away from Hollis, Queens. Like I was growing up when hip hop was being born. Literally Run DMC and Def Jam Records were like the town over.
It's amazing. Yeah, how was the music scene in New York back then? You got a lot of, yeah, I mean, it probably weren't even like full-blown concerts. It was more just people hanging out in different venues and listening to music. Yeah, what was that like?
It was great because I was really immersed in the punk scene of the time. My brother is 4 years older than me and used to kind of let me tag along with his friends. And that had a huge influence on my entrepreneurial life later on. But I think the way in which punk was communicated outwardly was that it was like aggressive and mean and a bunch of people who were like kicking the shit out of each other in a mosh pit. There is no more compassionate, empathetic place than a CBGB's mosh pit. Meaning, like, yes, you were all bouncing around and bumping into each other, but there was this like code of honor inside the mosh pit that if anyone fell down, people would like protect them and make sure they didn't get trampled. They would lift you up. Like it's sort of one of these things that doesn't get communicated outward, but like there's a huge difference between a like Lower East Side punk mosh pit in the 90s and a death metal mosh pit at the same time. Death metal mosh pit was like, we're going to knock your fucking teeth out and we're going to enjoy it. It's going to be fun and don't climb into this
It's
mosh
fun for
pit.
all parties involved, really.
Correct. Like you should have the right drug cocktail where getting your jaw broken is going to be something that you can just endure and come out the other side. A punk mosh pit was like, you know what? You're good just the way you are. If you want to be like, if you're like a little sort of like twig, if you're like a femme gay, we don't care. Just come into the mosh pit. We'll be good. We'll look after you. So I think there was this thing where everything that kind of made me undateable in high school was really valuable currency on the punk scene.
What made you undateable in high school? What were you like in high school?
Well, so we moved from Queens to Westchester when I was 12. And Rye, where we lived in Westchester, where I grew up in Rockaway, was like firefighters. Far Rockaway was one of the most dangerous ghettos in New York. Now it's mostly safe and gentrified and cleaned up, but it was very tough. There were fights all the time. It was very blue collar. And Westchester was like Morgan Stanley Country Club. You know, it was sterile and 100% white. It was a complete I didn't know that this I sort of knew theoretically that there were people who were like their names and faces were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and they must live somewhere. I didn't realize where they lived, and suddenly I'm going to high school with their sons and daughters. You know what I mean? So that was Westchester, and I had a really thick like Queens accent. I loved punk music. Everything about me made me a freak. Also, I had terrible grades. I was not a good student. Eventually, I found my tribe, and to this day, I have great friends from Westchester, but I wasn't popular. I wasn't the guy that all the girls wanted to date. I was like, he's weird. I was like, I was the icky kid that kind of dressed funny and was constantly running into Manhattan to gallivant around. And, I didn't fucking golf or play tennis or any of that shit.
Tell me more about this concept of tribe. I mean, it's in the first line of your bio, and I'm particularly interested in these earlier childhood experiences where you're trying to find your people. I think a lot of folks can relate to that. You're moving, you don't quite fit into the new surroundings. But then I'm also curious about the impact music has had on you and that mosh pit experience you're describing where people are helping each other. And there's something very primal about music and getting, and that is how a lot of tribes historically, right? We've bonded over things like music. So I'd love to learn, yeah, to hear more about your how you started thinking about the concept of a tribe, how you started exploring what your tribe might be.
Yeah, I think there are two different types of tribes. I think there are tribes which force conformity. They force you away from being yourself. And I think there are other tribes where the sort of requirement for entry is that you be the truest version of yourself. And those are two really different types of tribes. It's a lot harder to find, and that's what I loved about punk. That early, I don't know if I couldn't have identified it like that at the time that I was part of it, but there was this sort of radical acceptance. There was an expectation that you were weird, that you didn't fit in, that you completely owned and celebrated the aspects of your identity that didn't blend in wherever else you had to sort of operate. And that created its own tribe, but it was very much based on sort of DIY and authenticity. And like, if you can play two chords, you're more than welcome to get on stage. And that was really different than the tribe of Westchester County, which was all in my professional life, I call it a crush it summit. And I'll explain what I'm talking about. You and I get invited to fancy places where people who are seasoned executives and entrepreneurs and investors, you get invited to go, and it's usually like in Napa or some five-star resort someplace. And for the most part, they deteriorate very quickly into what I would describe as a crush it summit, where everybody has a very pre-canned elevator pitch of how they're crushing it. And no one's telling the truth. And everyone is just trying to determine whether you're useful to them. And no one is showing up being like, you know what? Shit's hard for me right now. They put on this costume. And in my career, I can smell it right away. Am I at a place where what's the price of entry to be part of this tribe? Is it you have to participate in a Crush It Summit? Or are you supposed to show up as a punk? Where it's like, you know what? I am deeply flawed. I'm error prone. I wake up at 2 in the morning, like worried that everything's gonna break and it's my fault. Um, and I'm gonna fucking own it, and I'm proud of all of it, and it is who I am, and take it or leave it. And I can like smell that right away. And that first signal that there are tribes where you are going to be valued for being the truest version of yourself versus a tribe where you're going to be pulled away from the truest version of yourself. The first really acute realization of what the cost of entry was at that time in my life.
It's kind of fascinating that I'm curious at what point in your adolescence you became aware of what your authentic self is, and to be able to realize that you're maybe the fact that you were a little bit weird and not into the same things that the other kids in school were into, that helped you form your identity sooner than people that are jumping on the same bandwagon. They like everything else that everyone else likes, which is not. And then if you go down that path, you end up at these like crush it summits where you don't really realize you don't know who you are, what you want, and you're just be like, oh yeah, I must do the same things that everyone else is doing in order for me to find happiness. But yeah, I'm curious if you've ever thought about that role of being a little bit of an outsider has ultimately helped you figure out who your authentic self was.
I mean, I'm grateful for it now. Like, are you asking me what is the instance where that came to fruition the first time?
Yeah, or just in terms of like how you found your authentic self that early in life.
So first of all, it's a journey. The way anyone finds their authentic self, you try on, you experiment with all of the rules of what you're supposed to be, and you try on a bunch of different outfits, and you put yourself in social environments, and you're going to like some of them and you're going to dislike others. And and as time went on and in adolescence, like, yeah, I played football on the football team. I did my best to not be a complete like outcast pariah in Rye, New York. I had really good friends to this day. I have really good friends from Rye. But I think at a certain point, it was like, do you guys want to come with me on the Metro North train to Alphabet City to see some really weird shit? Because I think the idea of like getting drunk off of shitty beer on a suburban golf course when no one's playing golf is just dumb. And the answer was, yeah, let's go check that out. You know what I mean? So I think there was just this like realization that there were things that were normal that I just didn't enjoy, and the way in which kids spent their weekend and devoted their attention and defined their own sense of self-worth. Like, I didn't give a shit. Or if I did give a shit, I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't good at like hanging out at keg parties and acting cool. I wasn't good at it. It felt weird. And I didn't come home from those evenings like, that was awesome. Throwing myself in a weird mosh pit where everyone had safety pinned their clothes together and you know, uh, that always felt right. I was really into jazz at the time, like hanging out in the basement at Smalls in the West Village when I was 15. Like, that was great. It was transcendent. I just, after a while, I knew what I liked. And when I did well on Wall Street, and it was like, great news, man. You get to play golf with this, CEO someplace. You've been invited. You made it. Or you get to like spend the weekend at the Kennedy compound in Hyannis. I'm like, I know I'm supposed to like this, but I don't enjoy it. Like,
I, I
I'm not
really, yeah, I
connecting
really,
in a meaningful way to anyone that I want to connect with. Like,
yeah.
I guess I recognize that this is part of the game if you want to raise capital and whatever, but like, it's not me.
That's a really great way to put it. It's that, yeah, just paying attention to how you feel after you leave one of those events. Like, was it interesting, or did you feel drained, or was it exciting? Was it something that actually you remember and you're excited to do again? Tell me more. You mentioned briefly your older brother. Tell me more about the impact of mentors in your life and how you've learned from those mentors. Maybe starting with your brother.
Wow. Well, my brother Jake is probably the most, next to my wife, I think my brother Jake is probably the most important person in my life to this day. And as a kid, I don't know how I would have gotten through childhood without him, to be honest. When I was really small, my parents had a very messy divorce. My childhood was, a lot of it was a shit show on the back of that. But Jake was this like pillar of stability for me. He was very loving. He kind of took ownership and accountability of my well-being in a way that was really beyond his years. He helped me with my homework. If he would bring me out with he's 4 years older than me. If he was hanging out with his friends and it was something that would be like, he was always like, hey, is it cool if I bring my little brother? So my exposure to like the New York City nightlife scene of the 90s, that would have never happened without him really like proactively exposing me to this other world. And my brother was 6'4" by the time he was 14. He's a 6'8" gynecologist now. Like, he's huge. New York City was a very violent and dangerous place back then. and I never was threatened. I never felt at risk because, and at the time, I'm like, yeah, it's because I'm fucking tough. No, it's because I was hanging out with my 6'8" brother, and he
And
was.
for the record, you're also a big guy, so it's not like, yeah.
I was not a big guy at the age of 14 or 15. Not really. Today I'm 6'2" and I lift weights and I look like someone who once played football. But back then, I'm like, wow, I must be pretty intimidating. I must no, it was like no, I had a big brother who also introduced me to girls. So, and to this day, like I speak to my brother almost every day. So he's like the number one first mentor. He set the bar at a really high height. He's a hugely important part of my life. I think the next, it's sort of interesting actually, now that I think about it. When I think there were a few hugely important mentors in my early career. One of them was Matthew Kiernan. So Matthew was the CEO of my first startup. He was the founder and CEO of the first startup I ever became part of. It was an investment research startup called Innovest. Matthew hired me. I had a master's degree in economics. I'd never, like, I couldn't have told you what a discounted cash flow model was. I couldn't have told you what, like, a derivative was. You know, I knew like interest rate policy, like whatever academic economics, I knew that. And Matthew was like, and I'd worked for a nonprofit in Scotland that focused on microfinance, like lending money to poor people in very small amounts or all around the world. And that's what I did with my economics degree. And I wanted to move back to New York, and I heard about this quirky startup called Innovest. Innovest was notorious for two things. One, it hired people from like SIPA who had really cool understanding of social science, who could mix it, who had some degree of a big data background and could develop totally original dashboards effectively for analyzing various industries with like kind of like black to just sort of try to put numbers around potential gray swan, black swan events. And they were very famous, niche famous, I would say, for that and having some really interesting good calls on the back of that capability. And then the other thing they were famous for was the fact that they had this complete miscreant culture. Like they had the biggest parties. There was a huge drug culture. It was very punk rock. It was not Wall Street. Even though our clients were hedge funds and quant shops and trading desks, what I'm wearing right now is what you wore to work at Innovest. And you kept a suit in the closet for when you had to go to the Citadels or the Renteks of the world. But like they were like everyone knew about like how Innovest was just weird. Anyway, Matthew became a mentor of mine. So he just liked my attitude. He's like, "Do you think the things that you analyze in microfinance, meaning when you make a loan to someone who's very poor, do you think that like translates into understanding the US housing market? And if so, how? How would you make those like what's the data you would need to build that analysis out? Like what's the fine line between responsible access to credit to an underserved demographic and predatory lending? And do you have some understanding of like unpacking debt service ratios in the United States and building out some leading indicators of when that is stable versus unstable? And at the time, that was literally the only thing you needed to know. It was 2005, booming housing market and the booming residential real estate market. Banks were thriving and it was this race to who could originate the most mortgages or securitize the most mortgages. And Matthew brought me in to initiate coverage of the banking sector. And the first report I ever issued basically predicted, no, this is not a sustainable growth. This is built on a house of cards, and it's going to take down Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Countrywide. And
When was this? When did you write that report?
that was June of 2006, pretty early.
And what was it that led you to believe that those three institutions in particular were at risk?
So we had really um, it wasn't we married a bunch of data sets that never I don't want to say never, but as far as I'm aware, no one married these data sets together. Number one, we looked by county and in cities by zip code at debt to income ratios. And we were also able to break that down by income quartile. And so we started to see like where that, first of all, real wages had stagnated in the vast majority of the United States for the past 5 years, while debt had climbed at 73%. And so those should kind of, to some extent, move in sync with one another, but that widening of that gap was like, makes sense to be taking on this amount of debt if your wages can sustain it and pay it back. And we were able to sort of isolate where the hot spots were around the country of where that was the most acute, where those was sort of like some degree of predictability, or we were willing to make a forecast that there was an unsustainable household debt service ratio in certain areas of the country. We also were able to find origination and securitization data from asset-backed securities of what banks were originating that debt and securitizing that debt and servicing that debt. And when we started to sort of hoover it all up, there was like 10 companies that were in the apex of it. It's not more complicated than that. It's a lot of data to unpack. Like we broke a bunch of servers trying to do it. But like, and I wasn't smart enough to do it any better. In other words, my training was not like, well, you have to compare that to tier one capital. And I didn't know what tier one capital was. I knew how to lend money to poor people, and I knew how to evaluate whether they would pay you back. That's it. In any other market circumstance, that would have been the stupidest way to make a big, bold prediction that a giant investment bank that's been around since the Civil War is going to get taken down. It's not there. There's peacetime analysis and wartime analysis, and I only had one tool, which was wartime analysis. And I happened to do it at the exact moment that peacetime was about to end. So, like, I don't want to understate the level to which luck was a huge factor here, because it was a huge factor. If they asked me to analyze banks at any other moment in history, I would have been fired in 2 weeks. At that moment in time, I had a hammer and I hit the right nail, and it was the right nail for that moment in time.
So what was the impact of this report being so early on before the financial crisis really started making waves?
The minute the report got released, so here's the tricky thing about being a bank analyst at that moment in time, in ways that were not true for any of the other sectors that we covered. This was before the Volcker rule. So our biggest clients were the banks that I was also analyzing. Yes, there were like laws in place theoretically that there was supposed to be a Chinese wall between the buy side and the sell side at these banks. No one gave a shit. Everyone walked over those walls all the time. So literally the minute the report is released, the House Counsel of Lehman Brothers called me and said, "Did you want to talk to me before you push this out?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" Uh, they're like, "Well, it's fake and it's wrong and we're uncomfortable with it, and we also are aware that we're one of your biggest clients and we're going to cancel our contract and we're going to sue you." And I'm 27. This is my first like toe getting dipped into the water of Wall Street, which is pretty shark infested at that time, maybe still. And I'm like, "Okay, I am so sorry. Let me make a few phone calls and get back to you." And I was ready to I called up Matthew Kiernan, who I mentioned before as one of those early mentors. And I'm like, "Matthew, you should fire me. Number one, this is the phone call I just got. I completely understand if you need to fire me. Number two, take the report down. Like, I am not cut out for this line of work. And I'm sorry I've put you in this deeply compromised position." And there was like a long pause, and Matthew just asked me, like, "What were you wrong?" That was his only question. I said, I don't think so. They didn't tell me my numbers were factually incorrect." He says, "Yeah, um, this is what happens when you're right. People who don't like you being right are gonna try to kill you. If you were actually wrong, they would have come to you with like, hey, we have a few edits that we wanted to they would have presented you with data and facts. They don't like your conclusions. So, and they called me before they called you, and I want you to know what I said to them. We will publish your research on the back page of the Wall Street Journal if they carry forward with any of their threats. So, you want to talk about a mentor? That dude had my back. And the only reason we were able to be early with one of the biggest predictions, you know, and like that's a huge call. Wasn't because we were the first people to have sort of said, something's fishy here. I don't believe that's true. A lot of people who are famous for being short were short after our report came out. I think it was only because he was willing to defend me in the face of just very powerful people scaring the shit out of me. And he's like, nope, I got you.
So what happened with the in-house counsel? Did they give it up or they keep pursuing this? And did you ever talk to those people again afterwards?
So the greatest thing that happened right when everything was starting. So there was a long time between me saying that and everything starting to unravel. Like a few months afterwards is when that first Bear Stearns fund collapsed and HSBC had a subprime account and like the things started to crack. There were very few cracks at that point. Delinquencies were pretty healthy in aggregate. All right, so what winds up happening is when Lehman Brothers is sort of circling the toilet of bankruptcy, um, this reporter called Jessica Silver Greenberg, who is now the investigative, I think she might be the head investigative reporter at the New York Times business section. But at the time, she was an intern at Business Week. And she's like, hey, do you mind? So she was like, we're trying to find if anyone saw this coming. And so at the age of like 28, I'm on the cover of Business Week. She's an intern. I should have been an intern, but I was actually the head of research at this point. So at the age of like 28, I'm on the cover of Business Week. And then there's just this huge like flood of inbound interest from that point on. And so I become kind of famous for a minute. I'm like the talking head on CNBC and everything and the Sunday news shows, and everyone wants to talk to me, which my young ego was not able to handle very well. But on the back of that, our sales skyrocketed while the world was melting down, and Innovest was acquired because of that call.
Wow.
But hold on, I have to tell you one story. You asked me what happened to the House Counsel of Lehman. I'm not going to say their name, but so I never saw this person's face, and it was a woman. And so things are going very badly. I'm on some panel at Smith Barney, and what's going to happen in the future of the housing market? Who is the guy who ran Moody's? Was it Mark something who ran Moody's Analytics? Do you know the guy I'm talking about?
I don't.
Mark Zandi, I'm going to say his name was.
What
Anyway,
what year was this?
this would have been 2008,
Right in the middle of
2007,
the storm.
2008.
Okay.
Yeah. It was right when the world was sort of blown up. So I'm on some panel and with Mark, I'm going to say his name is Mark Zandi. And this like woman is sort of wearing like a baseball cap and she's like hidden off to the side and she's very clearly trying to remain like hidden. And I'm like, all right, and she comes up to me as there's like a little scrum of people who want to talk to the panelists. And she's like, hey, do you mind if we go for a little walk? And I'm like, sure. Okay. She's like, I'm so and so. And I'm like, shit, well, we got off on the wrong foot, didn't we? Because I'm a nice guy. Like, I'm not the tough guy that's like, we're going to fucking kill you and we'll put you on the W. I was very like tentative and I was firm, but I was like very cautious. And she said, this conversation between us never happened, but keep going. You're not wrong. And to this day, she's one of my closest friends. She's a member of Punks and Pinstripes. It was very clear that like people who were way more powerful than any of us could have imagined were like, you have to be our attack dog. Doesn't matter if you believe it or not.
I was not expecting that ending. That is, you guys started off like that. Like, I'm going to sue you and destroy you. And now you guys are friends. Like, that is
Not just friends, like one of my closest friends ever.
no way.
Yes.
Okay, say more about that, about how you can take, because anyone else, like myself included, if you're in a situation you're getting threatened by some general counsel, like I would immediately go on, very least, like defense or start thinking about getting aggressive. But how do you turn like a confrontation like that into something that you diffuse it, and then to end up, it's a phenomenal outcome, right? You can turn these types of things into things that start a long-term relationship.
An institution that is doing the wrong thing is not full of people who are the wrong people, And I think once we got acquired and I'm on the epicenter of Wall Street, I'm working inside of Risk Metrics and later on inside of MSCI. And then after that, I'm the global head of innovation at Bloomberg. The ethical, moral, whatever report card you want to issue for the company as a whole, there's always individuals on the inside who have a very strong sense of integrity, who want to do the right thing in the right way, are going to have their warnings ignored of when they think business is behaving in a way that's unethical or unsustainable. Um, there's going to be people who are measuring long-term consequences in ways that the short-term demands of the market won't allow for. Always. And that's a feature, not a bug. When it all comes to shit, when the crisis starts to happen, those people, sometimes publicly, but very much, much more often privately, emerge. They are looking for allies. They're looking for people who will back up their concerns. And that's not the first time that's happened to me. And if anything, I think because I was sort of, in the epicenter of one of the biggest crises, you start to find a lot of people who are heroes in ways that if you're sort of removed from it, you would never guess they are there. She's one of them. And also, I should say that like a lot, it was like a year and a half that had passed between me issuing the report, her threatening to sue me, and the time where she's showing up in like a baseball cap and sunglasses. Like, I just want you to know I'm your biggest fan and you should keep going. And this conversation never happened. Like, I knew that she wasn't going to carry through on her threat. We had had some back and forth afterward about subsequent like research that I had published where she was very fact focused, like, hey, we weren't involved in that securitization. We were, though, involved in this one. Like, it became a professional, amenable relationship where we were having a conversation about the right things and the way that a good investor relations team should, you know.
I'm curious to learn more about the Innovest business itself. So you joined when you were pretty young. You write
Mhm,
this report that you think is going to get you fired, or boss and mentor stands by you and tells you to like keep going, keep publishing this, and
mhm.
then you're right, and the business just takes off from there. It's like one of the most pivotal moments in financial history,
Yeah.
and like you said, you're at the epicenter of this. Do you remember, like, what that did to the Innovest business itself? Like, what were your revenues beforehand? What happened afterwards? Like, what was the talking about the business side of this? And in particular, I'm also curious about the role of a junior person to make such an impact. Like, it's the report you wrote that then had this, like, what sounds like a big increase in revenues afterwards.
Yeah. We did great from it, but not as great as we could have. And I know that sounds weird to some extent, but let me explain. There was a huge, again, I know this after launching many businesses since then, but there's a huge sort of difference between the revenue model of Innovest and the analytical firepower that we possessed. And a lot of our analytical firepower was squandered because of the way in which Innovest sold its research. So where we got the most demand was when our analysts came up with weird ways of unpacking mispriced risk or opportunity in an industry. So we had a chemical analyst who was a chemist, who literally broke down the chemical compounds of like Dow, DuPont, Unilever, like all of these CPG companies and huge chemical manufacturers, and broke down the chemical compounds and then adjusted sales according to which chemical compounds were banned in what markets or heavily regulated in what. It was so creative, and we had another analyst who looked at the fracking boom and found out a way of ingesting meeting minutes from every residential or every municipality located on top of a shale basin to make a prediction of where residential zoning ordinances were going to ban fracking and adjusting sales in the oil and gas sector accordingly. Like, brilliant shit. and way out of the box. But ultimately, the thing that we were selling was ratings. We rated the companies and we rated the industries. And so what we were not selling, unfortunately, was like, here are 10 longs and 5 shorts in oil and gas, in banks, because and when we would get the most visibility and the most attention and the most inbound demand, it was because we had really good longs and shorts that were just out there but were like backed up with really robust data. But the product was a rating product. And so we had these like ad hoc price tags that we would slap on the research that informed the rating. And we would turn that into a report and sell the report on a one-off because demand materialized. But, the market for ratings is very much fueled by the size of your coverage universe. And people who like ratings are typically chasing beta. They're like buying commercial paper or they're trading mutual funds. Our best ideas were chasing alpha. They were long short funds. So we had a few rock star analysts that were constantly in front of really sophisticated buy side stock pickers, short sellers, etc. So yeah, we had probably FX increase in revenue on the back of my analysis, but it was people buying a report. It wasn't people buying a subscription to a like consistent stream of revenue. And when we were acquired within about a year, so we got acquired by Risk Metrics and then Risk Metrics got acquired by MSCI about a year afterward. The dream died. MSCI took our signal and took our rating and kind of were like, look, we don't want you to be analysts. We want you to help us build more indices. We're not looking for long short. We want to make sure that we're providing really good factor analysis for people who are not trying to beat the market. That's where the money is, passive income. And they weren't wrong, but what happened was everyone like me who was like, we're going to find a way to beat the market and find mispriced, actionable signals that no one else is tracking. There was kind of no place in the company for us after that.
So what happened? Is this what ultimately inspired you to write your book? What was that journey like inside the bigger company?
Well, I was one of those people who left after they were like, look, we're just an index company. Get your ratings, get them out on time, make sure the data is transparent. We don't give a shit if you're smart. We just care that it works and that no one's complaining that that their ratings are late. I'm like, you're not wrong. Like there's a great opportunity to make money, but that's just not me. And I had an opportunity at that point to join Bloomberg and become the director of innovation at Bloomberg, of like new product innovation at Bloomberg. Um, and that's really where, on paper, that's like the best dream job you could ever have. And I was so excited to go there and start making like serious Wall Street money. And I was pumped up. But dude, I'm not one of them. And I think, and that's really where the book started. I immediately got deeply sad for what I had left behind at Innovest. I started to seriously question, like, is it all worth it? I think a lot of entrepreneurs, I think there's this thing with a lot of people who achieve some degree of success where the trophies at a certain point start to feel like atrophy. And I'm like, I'm like, the first thing Bloomberg did is they teamed me up with a team of consultants from McKinsey, these like PowerPoint jockeys, you know, uh, and I'm like, I had spent so much time, working nights and weekends and not sleeping, building a model to analyze like the biggest housing crash in the freaking world. That for me was so thrilling. And that had nothing to do with PowerPoint. That was like build the model, track the model, look at the signal. Like the more you're having to explain why the model should be built, it is just, there's a huge opportunity cost. It all felt like analysis paralysis. And it was so political. When I first arrived at Bloomberg, they're like, could you build a model to analyze the Arab Spring? And I did. I found out this really cool way of evaluating like multiple instances of geopolitical shocks. And so, if there was civil unrest in Egypt, we could dial up this model that looked at similar circumstances of like 70 instances of like civil unrest in Egypt. things that looked like those events and then have a sort of pattern, if there was one, of how it impacted various commodity and stock prices historically. It was great. And they're like, cool, like this team from McKinsey's going to work. So for like 8 months later, I just worked my ass off over the weekend to build it. And they're like, well, you have to also look at how that's going to impact cash flow if you productize it and da 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 da. And it's like 8 months later, we have a 200 slide deck we present to the executive leadership team. And this wonderful guy at Bloomberg who I loved, guy called Norm Pearlstein, used to be the executive editor of the Wall Street Journal. Smart as hell and total, yes, he was a very senior guy, but total punk. Norm, during that meeting, he's like, look, your model's awesome, but the Arab Spring happened 7 months ago. I'm like, see, McKinsey? I fucking knew it. I knew it. What I'm trying to say is that the difference between being an entrepreneur and an intrapreneur was like very clear. And it informed my book. It informed the way I see the world, my sense of outsiderness. I reconnected with what made me punk while at Bloomberg in a way that I hadn't for a very long time because I just wasn't one of them. I didn't care about being invited to a golf outing with Mike Bloomberg. It did nothing for me. I cared about solving hard problems in a unique and differentiated way that made shit tons of money and made a dent in the universe. That's what I like to do. If I had a good day at work, it's because I made some headway doing that. If I didn't do that for a day, but was like given handshakes and high fives and hugs by like powerful people who have yachts and private jets, I had a terrible day at work. It didn't feel good to me. And so I think the sense that I was uniquely motivated to be impactful, but I'm surrounded by people whose primary motivation is like self-preservation, self-promotion, and politics was really hard for me to reconcile. And I knew it like within like a month of showing up at that company. I knew that this was not a good home for me, but I wound up staying there for 5 years.
I'm really fascinated by this topic, and I'm curious to get your take on this. The difference between like entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, and in particular, like looking at it from the outside, you look at a place like Bloomberg, and they have tons of resources, hire the
Yeah,
smartest people in the world,
sure.
and again, money, people, everything, you data, you name it, it lives there. And then you look at a startup that, to your point, like can afford to hire the senior editor of Wall Street Journal or anyone who's got like a crazy like pedigree. And then you put them side by side. It's like, okay, they solve this problem. And somehow the startups, more often than not, end up figuring it out, even though they don't have the best people, they don't have the money, they don't have the connections. And then, I'm curious about like what are the reasons why that might be the case. And like they have, and even if you were to take, let's say, like the person from the startup, to your point, put them in this other organizations, like you've built a great team with much fewer resources at your startup. Surely you can do something great here, and yet it still ends up failing. So I'm curious how you think about the reasons for that.
Yeah, so there's a couple advantages that a startup has that a heavily funded company does not have. But the biggest difference is a startup does not have any obstructionists. Their only blocker is money. They don't have people who are literally incentivized to thwart progress. And in any large corporation, there's kind of three competing forces in play at any moment in time. One of them is FOMO. Like, are we using the newest technology? Are we going to be left behind by modernity? Are we innovating enough? Are we transforming enough? Are there changes happening in the market that we are just not embracing and it's going to come back to haunt us? FOMO, however, in a startup, that's all you have to worry about. In a huge company, you have to reconcile FOMO with two other things, FULP and F you pay me. So F you pay me is like, I don't give a shit about your little AI data experiment. Like, I have to go on our quarterly earnings call in 4 days from now and explain how you're spending their money. and they don't give a shit about the blockchain. They want to know, like, what is our earnings per share this quarter? And if they find that we missed our number because we spent $7.5 billion on an AI lab, you're fucking fired. It's a very easy decision. I don't care that like AI is changing the world. I don't, it's not an infomercial here, dude. We're not on the cover of Fast Company. Like we're DuPont Chemicals, right? Like people have a very clear expectation of what we're supposed to make happen. So FOMO, yes, but also F you pay me, right? Then there's this other thing that no one talks about, which is FOLP, fear of losing power. The higher up the pyramid of power you get inside of a large company, the further detached you are from P&L, the further detached you are from actually building things that people buy. And the more your job will be consumed by attacking and defending, making sure that you can grow your fiefdom and prevent others from stealing it. At a certain point, there comes a moment in time where it has to be reconciled with the F you pay me meeting at a certain point. Like if you mismanage that and you're so political that you miss all your targets, at a certain point, it's going to catch up with you. Yes, but it can take years. There's not a single executive in a single large company who can't point to people who fail forward for decades. It is a feature, not a bug. And I was shocked by that and could not navigate it when I became that executive. When I'm an executive, and I assumed because of where I had come from, that once I got to the upper echelons of power at a place like Bloomberg, everyone was going to be thrilled that for the same reasons I was. Right? Like, we're going to solve tough problems, like sort of quantifying the economic impact of things like the Arab Spring. Like, why is that not fun? Like literally, these are the things that wreck hedge funds for generations. And we have the opportunity to turn that into a trackable signal. Like, what's not to like? And the thing that was not to like is like, well, someone on my team has been solving that problem for years. I'm getting credit for that already. I'm the go-to person that's put in front of like Citadel when they have questions about it. And so there are these like layers of obstructionism, like the skeptics, the cops, the traditionalists, the territorialists, these layers of obstructionism where literally because you were good at innovating, because you were great at launching new products that made 7, 8 figures very quickly, because you were good at reversing the decline of legacy businesses that were badly in need of a new lease on life, and you breathed new life in them, because you were good at it, those were always the moments where you were in the most trouble. Those were always the moments where you were a political public enemy number one. And that was the premise of the book, This Might Get Me Fired. Eventually, I sort of came to understand when I quit Bloomberg in 2015, if you're going to be a great innovator inside of a great company, it's not because you have the best technology. It's not because you have the best strategy. It's not because you have the best ideas. It's not because you're the best at execution. It's because you can anticipate the defense and call the right play. And that's a very different skill than being an entrepreneur. There is no defense when you're an entrepreneur. There's just scarcity.
Yeah, yeah, so interesting. And I have been on both sides of this. I started initially doing the data work inside of a large hedge fund, and then I went off on my own to do this. And I think I was just having this conversation with a friend about going in-house somewhere to build do anything innovative or entrepreneurial. And there's part of you that if you have had that entrepreneurial background and you have a good work ethic and so on, it's like, I can figure this out. I guess I understand people are gonna, there's the engineering department, there's the legal department, there are all these different people that I'm gonna have to persuade. But I've done this before. I know what it's like to run teams. And I think that is 100% true. But it is also the thing that gets you in trouble, because you be like, yeah, I can figure this out. Sure, you can. Like, and you can, to your point, like, realize, okay, I need to like anticipate the defense. I need to start calling these plays. The problem with that is that you don't realize how much of a cost that is. And yes, sure, you can do that thing, but that comes at the expense of all the other things that you then need to do in order to get this innovation happening. So just because like you think you can do it, and maybe you can, although a lot of people can't, it still comes at a cost, and you only have a certain amount of hours in a day, or a certain amount of energy that you can deploy to this. And if you're spending a large part of your energy playing the politics game, convincing people why they should care about your initiative, diverting resources from them to the thing that you care about, that's just less amount of your energy that you're devoting to the core problem, which is so hard on its own, even if you did not have all these obstructionists in within on your own team trying to do this.
I honestly think that if activist investors had concrete numbers of how many products that made tons of money, new builds, built by weird entrepreneurs who worked nights and weekends because it wasn't their official job description. And they knew how much they had either generated revenue, reduced cost, or mitigated risk. If an activist investor knew those numbers and knew how many of those initiatives were just killed for bullshit, because of political, like myopic dogma, stubbornness, power plays. I think if you knew how many of those things died on the vine inside of each company in the Fortune 500, honestly, I think there'd be very few companies that are allowed where their leadership wouldn't be overthrown by an activist investor. Like the amount of money that companies leave on the table for stupid bullshit reasons. We made an attempt because I'm still an economist by heart. I tried to actually calculate that number where we looked at like how many new products were launched by every company inside of the Fortune 5 and how many of them lived and made a lot of money and how many of them. The short answer is we got down to like 50 companies, and even that was really hard. But first of all, like the origin story of those initiatives is completely different than what people think is the origin story of great innovation. It didn't happen in a lab. It was like origin stories, it was always born out of urgency. There is no innovation if there is no crisis. And I think there's an understanding that like there is such a thing as a business punk. And a business punk is someone where when the status quo of a business creates um, a crisis of epic proportion, it is the business punk who is able to swoop in and fix the situation. The person who is completely, like, totally detached from the same things that got everyone else to be deferential and complacent and compliant. Someone who's like, I'm just not wired that way. It's not how I keep score. That person is uniquely capable of showing up when there's a giant fire breaking out and fixing it and launching greatness. Behind every AWS that was incubated inside of a huge company, there's some business punk who is like, I don't care if this gets me fired. I'm going to fix this. And if I lose my job from fixing it, then okay.
It's a fascinating way to look at it, and it definitely has political implications as well. And I'm curious how you think about this concept of you were talking about like fault of fear of losing power, where you have different department heads, different people that have their own fiefdoms, and they're not really incentivized to take risk and do anything super innovative because that can backfire. But they're definitely incentivized to just keep the status quo, maybe slightly expanding the boundary of what it is that they're doing. And in essence, what's happening is you have multiple teams. Like everybody's pulling in different directions. It might not even be a team. People are in it for themselves, and everyone's
Yeah.
trying to figure out how can I squeeze out a larger like market share of the compensation for myself. And then you have these moments of crisis, and this again this happens politically as well. When you see very clearly national unity where everyone's like, okay, we just got bombed in Pearl Harbor, like we're all going to put aside our political differences and we're going to come together and solve this crisis. And same thing within a company, right? Something major is happening and all of a sudden, okay, like, I don't care what the head of IT says or the head of legal or sales, you're all in this together and you have to figure this out. And whereas at a startup you are much more team oriented from the definition because you're facing an existential crisis. Like that is that you do have that element of crisis all along from the very beginning. Because if you don't figure this out, if you're not all rowing in the same direction, you will fail. And so I'm curious how you think about that component of team building and how people can come together to actually solve these problems. And then yeah, what someone might be able to do inside one of these organizations when it is not a moment of crisis to try to build up that kind of teamwork to solve problems.
If there's no crisis, you have to be very reasonable about what you can expect to accomplish. There are four crises that foment innovation: financial underperformance, disruption by a startup, M&A, or activist investors. If one of those four things is not present, you have to understand that no one, if anyone has to choose between politics and self-preservation and innovation, they're going to choose Fulp. You have to understand that you can't force that choice. Sometimes there's a person who has massive amounts of political capital and executive power and the ability to override the vetoes of everyone else who's a self-preservationist and say, I don't care if you don't like it, I'm calling in my favor and you're supporting this. That's extremely rare, and that's a very difficult leader to be. They don't last very long. But in the absence of either those four crises or a proactive leader, you have to temper your expectations of what you can accomplish. Everything is going to be a nice to have. Everything is going to be a nights and weekends thing. And the biggest mistake that I see entrepreneurs make is shooting for the moon in the absence of a crisis. You can't do it. Will like obstruction is The obstructionists have a reason and the political capital to force you to lose. I made that mistake. The only reason I know that is because it kicked my ass time and time again. I built so many things that felt indispensable to me, but my urgency was not shared by the institution as a whole. So if there's no urgency, there's no innovation.
Do you think it's possible to manufacture crises? Again, looking at political examples where everything is a tragedy and trying to maybe not to that extent where people get desensitized to it, but can you just say,
Politically,
"Hey,
we
look"
see it all the time. I
Yeah.
mean, Trump's entire playbook is like, hey, if you think what's going on in this big, beautiful budget is going to add $3 trillion to the debt and cause Elon Musk, my biggest ally, to leave, don't look at that. Focus on ICE raids happening in New York City. The decoy happens in politics all the time. Is it possible to manufacture a crisis inside of I don't know.
Does Bloomberg need an internal Trump to get innovation happening where everything's yeah, a crisis?
I think that's a really hard way to run a business. Some people do it, some people have it, but I don't recommend it. And the reason I don't recommend it is because Bloomberg happens to be a business where, on one hand, it has to evolve and change and become more forward. Progress is essential for a company like Bloomberg, but that being said, it dominates market share in its space. There are things that it has been doing for a very long time that it has to continue to do with operational excellence and predictability, right? Like there's not a real sense of urgency for Bloomberg to be something other than what it is, right? Are there opportunities? Sure. Is there opportunity to optimize legacy businesses? Sure. But being an innovator in a place like that or a place like JP Morgan, they're winning. They're winning. Already they're winning. So innovating in a place that's in third or fourth place is a lot easier than in a place where they already are on at the forefront. It's a different dynamic in a tech company, but I worked for Google. Like Google's also like, is there an innovation mindset that is sort of baked into people with executive leadership there? Yes, sure. Like they get more excited and are willing to put money to work for a great new idea, but they're winning. Now, the risk with that is that someone like Sam Altman quits and creates does the thing that you thwarted them to do and becomes an existential threat to your cash cow. But like, we shouldn't bullshit ourselves into thinking that happens all the time. Disruption's really hard. Most huge disruptive threats get acquired before they are actually an existential threat. M&A is the defense to disruption, not like counter disruption, not counter innovation. So no, I think you can manufacture crises to a point, but you're also to your earlier question, you have a sense of solidarity in a startup that's unique. No one's making as much money as they can or should. Everyone's betting on you're keeping score in decades. In a big company, you're keeping score in quarters. And so in a startup, when you're starving and you're scrappy as shit and you don't have any resources and you don't have any time, being in the trenches, to this day, like being in the foxhole of a startup there's nothing like it. Is it scary? Absolutely. But like those friendships, like the solidarity that you have when it's just like it's us against the world and the only person that can fix this is us working together. That's it. It doesn't have to be fair. It doesn't have to be right, but like it's up to us. There's no I don't know of another cultural phenomenon which just forces you to love each other in that way. I've never experienced it. I haven't. I've had it in spurts, but I've never had it where it's like it's us against the world and we're just gonna fucking go. And a startup just creates that in a way. I don't know that there's any other business environment that fosters that.
Yeah, kind of to your point, I mean, the startup is in essence in a crisis, fighting for its life, but it's not manufacturing it. It is authentic, and that authenticity, going back to our earlier conversation, right, is extremely important, and it creates that kind of unity. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs? People, you a few years ago, about to take your big Bloomberg job, very excited about it. How can you make it more likely that you can succeed? And one of the things one framework I'm getting from you in this conversation is to identify the regime that you're in. When you're talking about the housing crisis, to figure out if you're in war or peace. Kind of like your example, like if you're war or there's a crisis happening, you might have a different playbook as an entrepreneur versus if it's a time of peace when people are just trying to fight a little bit for their fiefdoms. And maybe, yeah, maybe you have different piece of advice for those two different regimes. But what can people do to try to make this a little bit better?
As an entrepreneur, so I think those are the what you just described is spot on. You do need to be able to distinguish between wartime and peacetime. But I also think it's very important once you realize that you are a business punk and that you are the entrepreneur and you are the innovator. You can be very open that you're not one of them in a way that, and I screwed this up. When I made that decision, like, look, I'm not going to kiss your ass. I was an insufferable prick. I was 27 years old when I figured out that the biggest financial calamity of our generation was going to happen. And it went straight to my little 20-year-old ego head. And so I'm like, how dare you try to manage me? And it turned me into this like arrogant prick that was just unmanageable. And to be honest, Bloomberg's doing great. There was a lot I could have learned from Bloomberg that I refused to because I had too much of an ego. So I think going into it with some sense of curiosity and being of service is much more important. Like, let me know how I can help you get shit done that's important to you is a very healthy way of finding the crisis and being invited to solve it. I didn't have that. I went in with this mentality of I'll show you, you miserable scumbags. And no one likes that. I don't like that. Like if that kid came into my office right now, I'd throw them out. But I do think that there's a thing that over time I've come to understand and capitalize on, which is what I call punk sonar. And it's exactly what I described before with that woman from Lehman Brothers who became one of my best friends. Inside of these institutions are incredibly bold, brave, countercurrent, think against the tide, build against the tide, intrinsically motivated to put points on the board and solve the hardest problems. And they don't always wear it on their sleeves. And sometimes they do what they're told to do because they have mortgages and they have kids and they need the benefits and all the things that are adult responsibilities. But you have to know how to like emit the punk sonar and you have to know how to pick it up. And you have to be very smart about that. And I think something that within Punks and Pinstripes I'm very proud of is like we are very good from the outside of like putting that signal out there. And if you cannot, I think there's a different way of saying it actually, Matei, which is this. When you're a punk and the more senior you are as a business punk, most people's advice is not helpful anymore. We live in an environment where experts without experience sell advice without accountability. That is the nature of the age of thought leadership, of the age of the internet, of the age of McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group, and all of these people who create PowerPoints for a living and articles in HBR. And when you're a punk And the more senior you become, the only people who are credible, who can credibly be of service to you, are people who can show you their scars, who have been through the same thing and can tell you with conviction, you are not alone. And so I think it's very important when the best way to emit punk sonar is to be totally upfront about what's keeping you up at night. Where are you falling down as a leader? What are you scared of? What are you trying to move away from, and what are you trying to move toward, and why is it hard? And the more open you can be, and the more you can say the shit that's hard in a way, but you're like, and without beating the shit out of yourself, but just being like confident and proud, like, hey, this is the cost of doing business, is you do things that are hard. You're going to find a lot of people who have been through the same thing, who are motivated intrinsically to be of service to you, to show up for you, as opposed to the alternative, which is you show up at a Crush It summit where everyone's trying to raise capital from you, or everyone's trying to give capital to you, or, everyone's trying to aggrandize their own ego with some, and, external definition of making it. And no one's showing up and being like, you know what? I'm doing something really fucking hard and it kicks my ass. If I say that to you, you're not going to sit there and look at me and be like, you pussy, right? You're going to be like, tell me about it. Can I show up? Can I help you? I've experienced the same thing. I wonder how I can, like, maybe we can join forces and solve the same thing at the same time. There's incredible solidarity when that emerges. And I think anyone who's an entrepreneur, but also anyone who's an entrepreneur, has to find the way where they can show up in that way and understand that that is the basis of strength, not weakness. And I think that that's missing in our world. And I think a lot of people who are building epic shit leave a lot of growth on the table because they can't show up in that way, or don't show up in that way.
Yeah, I love that. So I think it's a good segue into Punks and Pinstripes. What is it that you're doing there to bring these people together? And tell me more about that. That's
Yeah. So look, I think I mean, you've heard my story by now, but I think what I've noticed is that successful people have two mountains of success in their life. And in the first mountain, it's kind of what I described, like get the exit, get to the C-suite, get into executive leadership of a giant company, get recognition, like feed your ego more and more and more and more and more. And at a certain point, it's not fulfilling. And then there's the second mountain, where you still have fire in the belly, you still need money or want money, you're still driven, but it becomes really important for you to make that so it's aligned with the impact you want to have, the people you want to be working with your own truth. And I think most executive communities are very much geared toward the first mountain, and Punks and Pinstripes is for people who are climbing the second mountain. How we do that? First of all, we're really picky about who our members are. But second thing is, we have a really strong set of rules, and we have a strong format of how we interact with one another. So first of all, we have huge sit down. We have big dinners and we have small dinners. The big dinners are open to people who are not members, and we interview someone who's somewhat famous about the second mountain of their life. We call those our chapter 2 dinners. So a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Bill Stepney. Bill, do you know the hip hop group Public Enemy?
I do, yeah.
So Bill was the founder of Public Enemy, and he was the president of Def Jam Records, and he's on our board. Bill was not a hip hop guy originally. He was the black guy who showed up at punk shows, and he loved the Clash. And when he started, and then in the early 80s, when hip hop started to emerge, he was like, we need a group in hip hop that's like the Clash version of, like, rap music. And that's how Public Enemy was born, with his friend Chuck D. Bill today is a professor at NYU, totally other life. And so we interview people like Bill about, like, was the English professor the guy running Public Enemy? Or, like, did that emerge way afterwards? And we just kind of talk to them about the biggest, like, exiting that first chapter, and when did the second chapter begin?
What was that answer? How did he transition from, yeah, that to English?
What was most important for him after his life in music, and he's still in music. What people don't know about Def Jam Records is Slayer was signed to Def Jam. Like, Def Jam was also a punk and metal label, and that was all Bill. So there's a side of that label and the side of him that people don't understand, and he's the musical director for every Spike Lee movie. But what was really important for him when he achieved a certain level of success was sending the ladder back down. He climbed to the certain heights, and he's like, "There's a lot of kids that deserve to have the success that I had and just don't know where to start." And that motivated him to go back and become a professor. That's his second mountain. But man, he was great. He's like the nicest, most humble guy you've ever spoken to. Part of the format of our meetings is we have one member. The question we ask is, what's the hardest challenge you're wrestling with that's the hardest for you to talk about? And we have really strict rules of how to help a punk. One of those is, do not give advice. Just because you've read every book by Ray Dalio or Seth Godin or Simon Sinek does not mean you're qualified to be of service for someone who has seen some shit, who's going through a hard time. So if you've been through the same thing and you've come out the other side, talk about your experience going through the same thing. Another piece of advice we have is, another one of our rules is, curb your ego. No one needs to know about your credentials. Everyone who's in the room is qualified to be in the room. So we don't need to know. Don't turn this into a crush it summit. Don't use this as an opportunity to validate how wealthy and powerful you are. Like, you're here, right? Take that shit off, check it at the coat stand, come inside and be a fucking human being for a minute. And like, some of our members, like the chief transformation officer of Nike is a member of Punks and Pinstripes, and the CEO of Oracle Healthcare. And like, there are people who are really big deals. You would never know it. It's the most chill. I'm not going to be specific about it, but you and I were met at an event which was very much a crush at Summit, in my humble opinion. Private jets involved. It was a lot of people talking about money and how much money they have and how they're going to make more money, and like aggressively pitching their startup idea into your face in the 30 seconds that you met them. Punks and Pinstripes is the opposite of that energy. It's come in, show up, be of service, ask really good questions. And if you hear something where you've been through the same thing and come out the other side, try to help. Follow up, see if you can like make a commitment to call them every Friday for a 30-minute conversation to coach them out of their jam. And I think it's the community I needed and couldn't find when I hit the top of my first mountain and knew I needed something different and more.
It's amazing. Are you guys mostly in New York City in
We are
person? Like,
exclusively in New York City. We learned this in a very painful way, but it costs money to be a member. And it's a really shitty investment for me to try to build the infrastructure for in-person events in London, in Austin, in Chicago, in LA, and San Francisco. So we learned that by blowing a bunch of money and trying to set up new chapters all over the country and the world. So we're only in New York. We have some technology, but in reality, it is an in-person community. We have dinners every week. There's a Punks and Pinstripes event going on. They range from like very intimate members only dinners with no more than 12 people to much bigger events, bigger, like limited to 50, but those are also sit down dinners. But yeah, it's only New York. We have members who are from out of New York, but the condition of their membership is that they commit to coming to New York at least 5 times a year or their membership doesn't get renewed. And we have a cap. There will never be a first member of Punks and Pinstripes. I never, ever, ever want to have to sacrifice curation and intimacy in order to make this thing huge. It's a perfectly healthy cash flow that I can live off of and provide incredible value for everyone who's here. And I have complete confidence that I can take any member of Punks and Pinstripes and parachute them into a weekend retreat with any other member, and they're going to come out of that weekend best friends. And the minute that's no longer true is the minute we're too big.
it's really fascinating to even look back at how we started this conversation about tribes and people, to then talk through what can go wrong in a large organization when people are not part of the same tribe. Everyone's trying to do something on their own, and it requires a crisis for people to come together, which is ultimately like a negative event, very stressful, and you're fighting to survive, to what you're doing now, which is bringing people together in a more positive atmosphere and having those people get value from these kinds of interactions. And how have you felt personally giving up this, I'm gonna change Bloomberg and therefore change the world and do these like crazy big things, to now focusing on, I never want to talk to more than 200 people, but I want those 200 people to be like the best people that I can surround myself with.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, what has your journey been to this second mountain?
it's a great question. My life is simpler, and my sense of happiness is simpler. Like, I get it's a weird thing. A few months ago, CNBC invited me on to talk about something. I don't even remember what. I did the call, I had the interview, I was put on air, and then I hung up the phone and I made breakfast. And I remember it like uh later on, my wife was like, "So how was your day?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's cool. I had breakfast, like made it to the gym. A few that member, joined." And she's like, "Okay, cool." And then like 10 minutes later, I was like, "Oh shit." And I was on CNBC. And I was comparing that to like the 27-year-old me who predicted the subprime mortgage crisis, and CNBC is like, "We need you on Squawk Box like right away." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I did it. I did it. I did it." Yeah, this is I think I appreciate, I think there's a place I've come to in life where I live most days feeling like I have everything I need and most of what I want. And the first mountain was, how can I get everything I want and don't? And I think your life gets a lot simpler when you're able to sort of make that shift. I don't know when it happened or why it happened or how it happened. I just know that it happened and it's better. I never had enough. And that's not to say that I'm ambitious. I have things that I want to accomplish and have not yet accomplished. I'm very driven. I have all of those things are true, but I don't live my life from a place of deprivation. And I think that's a mindset shift. I think I don't know why it just is. Maybe I'm just getting older, and that's what happens when you get older. I'm not sure.
So, for anyone interested in learning more about Punks and Pinstripes, where can they go to try to get in?
So if anyone wants to try to get in, it's a very simple process. We don't accept applications. Just come to some of our events. That's it. Come to our events, hang out, enjoy yourself, eat really good food. Our open events, our chapter 2 dinners are it's free for members. It's $150 for everyone else. And we have a mini help a punk during those dinners. How the application process begins. You just show up, and if you enjoy it and we enjoy hanging out with you, then we'll invite you to a next smaller dinner. And if you still enjoy it and we enjoy hanging out with you, then usually we'll make an offer for you to join. So in reality, there's no way to apply. You just go to punksandpinstripes.com. You find an event coming up that you'd like to come to. You apply to come to the event.
It's a very punk way of joining a group. Like, there is no obligation, obviously. It makes sense. You just show up,
But no,
and if you're
but
lucky.
there's also nothing you need to learn. By the time you've been to a few events, it's like, okay, so this is what you guys do together. You have all the information you need to make a decision about whether this is a worthwhile investment for you. And we have all the information that we need in terms of like, when you're here, are you adding to the energy? We know that. Everyone can figure that out on their own. And dude, we have cycled through so many shitty top of funnel experiments to get people to join. And like at the end of the day, the community, we hang out together. We talk about real shit together. We goof off together. You either like that or you don't. That's how you should determine whether it's right for you, and that's how we should determine whether you're right for us. Period. There's no bullshit involved, just like punk music. You knew what the Ramones were talking about the minute they opened their mouth. There was nothing hidden.
Speaking of
Us.
punk music, one last question to end this with. Kind of, what punk band would you recommend to, let's say, a beginner who doesn't know much about punk, and then also to someone who's been in it for a while, like, what cool new things are you listening to these days?
Whew. Beginner punk music. I have 3 beginner punk bands. So there's pre-punk. Like the inspiration for punk has got to be Iggy and the Stooges. So Iggy Pop and the Stooges. The Stooges' Raw Power. If you listen to that album and you don't like it, I will judge you, number one. Number two, you probably won't like punk. Second album, Patti Smith, Horses. It's a very different variant of punk. It's art punk, but brilliant album. Gloria on that album is an incredible song. Not for everyone, but then there's a third variant, which I would say is Bad Brains at the Atlantis. Bad Brains was like an early 80s hardcore punk band. You will never hear Bad Brains on the radio. Like, it's different than the Ramones. It is just like in your face. You can't understand what the guy's saying. Best. So good. They were the inspiration to the Beastie Boys. So those are my three starter albums. Who is a modern punk band that there's a lot. These guys are incredible. OCs. I threw myself into an OCs mosh pit at the age of 47 earlier this year. I need to like stop that. I'm too old for that shit, but
How'd that
it's
go?
deeply cathartic. So I did that. And the Idols out of they're a London punk band. They are incredible. And they're huge. They're like selling out really big venues. Idols are great. And Idols, we started at the very beginning talking about the love of a punk mosh pit. The Idols mosh pit is the nicest. Like they mosh their ass off. Like you will have a foot in your face. There's going to be bodies crowd surfing 100% of the time. It's extremely kinetic. And the minute anything goes wrong, people are like, "Oh, hold on, stop. We got to help this guy out." Like in between songs, everyone's hugging each other. It's the nicest. Like most there's a one of my good friends who's kind of the inspiration behind a lot of like my belief on brand is a guy called Michael Shine. He wrote a book called The Hype Handbook, which I highly recommend. And Michael and I talk about punk music all the time. And you should interview Michael Shine, by the way.
Introduce us. I'd love to.
But one of the things that he said is that hippies are nice people, are mean people pretending to be nice, and punks are nice people pretending to be mean. And nowhere is that more true than in an Idol's mosh pit.
I love that. Well, that's a phenomenal way to end this conversation, Greg. It's been a pleasure learning about your life, business journey, and looking forward to coming to one of your.
Cool, man. Yeah, I would love to have you there, and thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.